and we'll go from there. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's 3 o'clock, and we like to stay on track here. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this lecture. Just a reminder to please silence your phone or anything that might make noise. We would appreciate that. And we'll have some time at the end of today's lecture, as always, for questions, and we'll use the microphone so everyone can hear. I'll do my best getting around to everybody quickly. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we have been hosting the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services since 1983. So if you do the math, that's 40 years. So we're celebrating 40 years this year of coming over here and connecting our faculty and staff with you folks. So thank you for having us as always. And to celebrate those 40 years, we are hosting some of Whitewater's most, I don't know, I think all of our faculty are pretty great, but some of the best here today. And today's speaker is no exception to that, of course. Dr. Pilar Melero is a professor of Spanish and Latinx literature at UW-Whitewater and the chair of the World Languages and Cultures Department. She also teaches for the Department of Women and Gender Studies. It's really Monday. I'm so sorry, everybody. I'm having a little bit of a rough day. She won the State Council on Affirmative Action Diversity Service Award in 2021 and the UW-Whitewater Faculty Service Award in 2022, as well as the College of Letters and Sciences Service Award in 2022. Dr. Melero has published 4 books, numerous academic publications, poetry and short fiction, and is the author of the Waukesha County, City of Waukesha, and Town of Waukesha entries in the Encyclopedia of Milwaukee. She worked as a journalist for the Waukesha Freeman, the El Paso Herald-Post, and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Born in Mexico, Dr. Melero moved to Wisconsin at age 15 in 1981 and graduated from Waukesha South High School in 1984. The UW-Whitewater with a BA in Spanish and journalism, the University of Texas at El Paso with her master's in Spanish, and UW-Madison with her PhD in contemporary Latin American literature. She became Lucas's grandmother in February 2023, has 2 grown children, Isabella and David, and lives in the Whitewater area with her partner and their 4 cats. Please welcome Dr. Pilar Melero.
Hey, thank you, everybody, for spending part of your day with me. I'm really excited to be here. I thought I could do something not as academic, because why do I have to do something very academic? So instead, I'm going to focus on my creative side, the short stories, and so that's what I'll be sharing with you today. And so I'm going to start with these 2 dots in Lucas. This is Lucas, my grandson. He's 7 months now, and that's outside of, that's on Cold Spring Road, where I live, and he loves going for walks, and so that's Lucas. So anyway, we start with this picture, and I will talk about its meaning in a minute. So again, thank you. I'm going to start with Lucas. So 2 dots, Lucas. And you see the dots right there, the large dot and the small dot? Last June, on a Sunday afternoon, I came home from Lake Geneva, where I was touristing, to find 2 dots of blood on my clothes. 2 dots, a large and a small dot on my right breast. The phenomenon continued throughout the summer, seemingly sporadically, but not really. The dots appear every time I spend time with my 5-month-old grandson, Lucas. As doctors consider all possibilities, including breast cancer and pituitary gland disorders, I began thinking deeply about their meaning, the symbolic way of 2 dots of blood. 2 random dots, not a colon, which would then offer some type of explanation, not the 3 dots and ellipses suggesting history left unwritten or perhaps still to be written. 2 random dots next to each other. What, I asked, did that say about my budding relationship with my grandson? Lucky enough to have grown up surrounded by loving grandparents, aunts and uncles, and cousins, the unexplained 2 dots worried me deeply. Was my story with Lucas going to be cut off at the second dad? Would his memories include even a vague notion of his abuela? Abuela is grandmother in Spanish. Was he to grow up without the hugs and kisses, sin los mimos of abuela? Who will spoil him rotten? Who would tell him every day how beautiful he was? But most importantly, who will fill in the gaps of ancestral memory if the storyteller of the family was no longer around? Selfish of me, perhaps, but I also wonder, and I wanted, and I still want, to be present in his days, in his pain, in his happiness, in his words, en sus palabras. I want my boiling springs and my swinging bridge, my love for the old country to be part of his bedtime stories, for the Spanish language, my language, to bounce around in his mind right alongside English and the few Norwegian words that still inhabit the Hansen memory. And so, as Carrie approached me about giving this talk, I thought about grandmothering and what it means for me, both as a grandmother and as a granddaughter, and its role in memory building, en el hacer memoria. My grandmother had this saying she would tell me all the time. If I couldn't remember something, she would say, haga memoria, mija. Like, try really hard to remember, but haga memoria really translates to makes memory, right? Which is so close to the English, make some memories, right? So I like that. And so it's like, the role and my role in helping him memory building, en el hacer memoria. And I'm going to move this. So that's Lucas and me. And here we are today talking about metates. And the metate is that grinding stone that you see right there. And I'll tell you why I have that in the presentation. Talking about metates, grinding stones, food, and stories, and the role in el hacer memoria, making memory, making memories. And continuing to bond that grandparents share with their grandchildren, and that may or may not become a bond beyond the brevity of life. I will start with a key year of Hacer Memoria, 1976, and then move on to two short stories that have become part of that bond with las abuelas Bernarda and Isabel, two anchors in my life as a cook, a storyteller, and now as an abuela. And so that's where we start. And so that's a grinding stone. Does anybody know what a grinding stone is for? Grinding? Uh-huh. Yes, and so we used to have a mill where we took the corn to get, to get it nice and ready for cooking tortillas. But my grandma was a perfectionist, and she always did it again in the metate every single morning. And so before every morning she woke up and we made, I don't know, 100 tortillas every morning. So she did them in the metate. And so I just, that's a very, this is part of our indigenous ancestry, right? Because I'm Mexican, and my DNA says that I'm 42% native, indigenous, 32% Spanish, and 14% Portuguese, 11% Portuguese. My other grandmother was a Portuguese heritage. Her dad came directly from Portugal. So this is the grinding stone is very deep in my psyche. It's very deep in my culture. It's part of who I am. So I wanted to make sure that you understood what that was. And you can grind anything, for the tortillas. If anybody has eaten mole before, you have. Okay, so all the ingredients can be also processed there. So this is our old-time blender, right? We did everything by hand. It kept you healthy, with very strong arms, and but also very tired. And so I will now move on from grinding stones, a year of cooking, and other ways to stay in touch with las abuelas even after they pass on. So these two pictures that you see here, this is a bridge. It's a swinging bridge. And where I grew up, our town was divided by a river, right? There's the north side of the river and the south side of the river. And I live on the north side of the river, and I used to think that the world ended, beyond my house, because my mom always said my dad went north, and I'm like, why does he go there? There's nothing there. There was mountains and mountains and mountains and more mountains and no roads, nothing. We were the end of the world. And so the only way to get out of town was through that bridge, right? Cross the bridge and go over to the south side where the school was and the church and everything else. And then from then we could take a little bus to the city, which would take us about half an hour to get to the city, and then we had access to banks and everything else. But it was pretty isolated, right? So that's that bridge right there. And the other is a pathway that is in the mountains, and it's a pathway to the hot springs. I do not believe in showering or bathing with cold water. It's pretty interesting that I am from a town called Atotonilco, which means hot springs, and right now I live on Cold Spring Road. So went from the hot springs to the cold springs, right? And so that pathway is on the edge of the mountain, and then on the other side of the pathway, there's nothing. There's a river way down deep. And so every day or, 2 or 3 times a week, depending on how, who went with me, I just ran over the, 2 miles to go over to the hot springs and bathe in the hot springs. Of course, you were all sweaty by the time you got back, walking through the mountain that long. But so that's what those pictures are, and they're key because I will be talking about them in my stories. So let's talk about 1976, a summer like any other. I turned 11 in 1976 and set out to live my summer life like any other summer, running on the swinging bridge and taking daily walks to the hot springs or 2 times a week, whenever we felt like it, with my mom, my cousins, my favorite tia. Tia means aunt. See, life in our sleepy town on the foothills of the Sierra was anything but boring. Being an only child, I did not have any babysitting duties like my cousins. Some of my cousins had 10 brothers and sisters, and we were sitting once outside of the house of one of them, and there was a plane, and we were all excited. Look, there's a plane, and we're looking at the plane, and my cousin says, plane, go away. And I said, why do you want it to go away? It's fun. Let's look at it. And she's like, no, every time the plane comes, I get a new brother or sister. I don't need any more. It's like, go away, plane, right? She associated that with her mom getting pregnant, and she got more. It was probably true. Her dad was also in the U.S., and he came home, on a plane. So there was probably some truth to that. So anyway, I had time on my hands, right? I had time on my hands. I didn't have to babysit. And so I was free to play with whichever cousin would come and join me, roam the edge of the river, ran across town on our swinging bridge, scaring the occasional tourist who was already scared by the moving platform. I love going to the hot springs with my mom, Tia Maria, or whomever was heading over to the mountain, to El Agua Caliente, as we called it. Or I could roam the town alone or following Abuela Bernarda and Tia Concha. And so let me tell you a little bit about Abuela Bernarda and Tia Concha, and we're going to move here to these images. La Cuentacuentos, the storyteller. These images are actually from New Mexico. This is New Mexican art, but I always find that my culture where I was born is way closer to the culture of New Mexico than to the rest of Mexico. We eat the same things, we have the same traditions, and one of our traditions is La Cuentacuentos. There's always somebody, or there was in town, who told stories, right? We lived in the mountains. There was no TV. My aunt bought a TV, brought it home, and we were all excited. We sat on the floor and just were ready to watch TV, and we're like, why is it just raining on the TV? There's nothing there. We had no antenna. So you all call it snow, we called it rain, right? So we just sat there. It's like, this is the most boring thing in the world. We don't like TV. So we went outside to play again. So we had the storyteller, and my grandmother was a town storyteller, and so was her daughter, Tia Concha. And so I just wanted to give you an image because really that's what she looked like, telling stories with her round figure and all her grandchildren around. That's what she looked like. So there she is. That's us. This is probably one of the times when she was telling stories and somebody came over. There used to be ambulant photographers who would come over and see if anybody wanted to take a picture because we didn't have cameras. We didn't have much, right? So can you guess which one I am? Huh? There's a little one in there, the tiny one. Yeah, that's me. That's me. I'm probably 6. Once upon a time, 1970 something. And that's my grandmother, the one in the middle. That's Bernarda. She was the storyteller. So she was the storyteller for the whole town. You see, Abuela Bernarda was a cuentacuentos. She was a storyteller. She and Tia Concha, one of her daughters, were the town dream guests and storytellers. They had a routine. So this is my grandmother lives on one side of town, and about half a mile away, her daughter lives, right? So every morning, my grandma would wake up and say, I'm going to go see Concha. I'm going to go see my daughter, say good morning, right? We didn't have Facebook at the time, so you had to say good morning in person, right? So she would walk over to Tia Concha's house, and she would knock on the door, and Tia Concha would come out and say, welcome to my palace. It was a 2-room adobe house, but she called it her palace, right? And she'd say, welcome to my palace. My grandmother would come in, and they would have cookies, coffee, whatever they had, and then my aunt would say, okay, I'll walk you home. And so she would walk my grandmother back to her house. And they would do that all day. They just walk. But they weren't just walking with each other. They were talking to everybody they met. And so they would meet somebody and say, hey, how are you? Well, I'm good. How did you sleep? I slept well. Did you have any dreams? Oh, I dreamt with a bull. Okay? Was the bull angry? Yes, the bull was angry. Well, you had to watch because there's some angry person coming to your house, and they would just make up stuff. I'm pretty sure they were making up stuff. Was the bull happy? They would be guessing all these things, right? What's happening around your world, what's hiding behind these dreams, right? So they would guess everybody's dreams, and people looked them over. It's like, this is my dream today. This is what I feel. They guessed everybody's dreams. They told them stories, and I just followed them. And I stopped to listen to whatever they were telling people, and I just followed them all day. That's what I did. It was fun, right? Sometimes I would hide under the table when they were telling stories that I wasn't supposed to hear, so that I could get the full gist of the thing, right? So that's my grandmother. Tia Concha is not there. That's some other aunts and uncles and my little cousins and my mom, my dad. So she was a cuentacuentos. But the summer of 1976, things were shaping a bit differently. Having finished elementary school, I was 11 at the time, my mom made plans to have me take the entrance exam for middle school. There were only 2 middle schools in our municipality, in our county, and both of them out of our town. And aspiring middle school students had to take a test. You couldn't just go to middle school. You had to take a test, and you had to get an 80 or above. If you did not, they didn't consider you worthy of attending middle school because you probably wouldn't do well. So I was ready to go take my middle school test and get my 80 and be in middle school. So I was all set to take the test when we received a letter from the U.S. consulate in the city of Guadalajara to show up on a certain date for an appointment. And the appointment was because my father was trying to get us a visa to come to the U.S., right? Because he had lived in the U.S. since before I was even born. So he's like, okay, I really want you here. You're 11, and I don't know you. The first time I realized my dad was at my mom's house, I was probably 4, and I said, why is a man sleeping with you, right? There's a strange man there. That's your dad. Why do you know that? Because I wasn't growing up with him, right? So my dad was trying to remedy that. And he says, we're going to take you to you have an appointment because we were to leave our town and join him in some unpronounceable place. What do you think where do you think we were going? Wisconsin, Waukesha. We were going to head over to Waukesha, Wisconsin. It's like, okay, well, that sounds like Mars to me, but I guess that's where my dad wants us to go. So what happened is that things did not go well. Our visa was denied, right? And so we couldn't go to the U.S. And so I went back to the town. And not yet. Okay, so our visa was not approved. And by the time that I returned home from the appointment with the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, I had already missed the entrance exam for middle school. My mom and I would not be joining my dad in the U.S., and I would not be attending middle school. I watched sadly as my friends moved to the city, sharp in their middle school uniforms, and return home on weekends with brand new words and stories to tell. Life had other plans for me. I spent that summer and the year after making tortillas, cheese, butter, cajeta, which is a type of preserve, and cooking with la abuela Isabel and la tía María, and roaming the town listening to abuela Bernarda and tía Concha all year. So cooking food and cooking up stories. So roaming the town with abuela Bernarda and tía Concha, listening to their stories and becoming myself a child cuentacuentos, a dream guesser. It was there and then, in my years of making tortillas and mixing spices as the kitchen filled with the aromas of roasted peppers, that my life filled up with words that would spill out of me in the evening when I repeated the stories I had heard with the Melero Cardosas, my dad's side of the family, to the Avitiasidas, the cooks, my mom's family. Those words are still with me and continue to spill out, but now as writing. And as cariñitos to my grandson. We joke with my grandson that the only Spanish he's going to know is, qué hermoso eres, because that's all we say to him all day. You're so beautiful. Grandma is like, we need to expand the vocabulary, because that's all we tell him. Lucas, or I'm also, so with my cariñitos, my grandson Lucas, or that I'm also living life in that, now that I'm also living life in that gorgeous suit called Abuela. Today I will share with you two stories. Hervideros, which was published in my first book of short stories. It's a bilingual collection of short stories. It was published in Mexico. And so the story is called Hervideros. Hervideros means hot springs, actually boiling springs, because there are boiling springs there. I mean, you fall in, you're dead. The water is that hot. We also have better springs that are not, hot. We have springs that will send anybody who's not used to it, make them jump to the river because it's too hot and they feel like fainting. But you also have some warm springs, right, where you can train if you're not used to the hot springs. So I have titled this story Hervideros, and it was published in this book that you see here. And I have another story called The Fig Tree that was just published this year in this book, but because it's in Spanish in the book, I'll read you the English version. Most of my writing, I do it, sometimes I create it in English, sometimes I create it in Spanish, and then I do another version in whatever language I didn't do, just because my family is so bilingual that I just want to leave everything in both languages. So the first story recovers some of my grandmother's stories, right? So I'm going to read you a little bit from this story, from this book. This is Boiling Springs. Avispa, that's what she called me. You can see from my picture, I was a thin little thing, so she called me a wasp. I was a little wasp with a tiny, tiny waist. So she would say, Avispa, go light my cigarette. Grandmother would order me in a thundering voice that I knew not to question. Nor would I want to. I obeyed, excited that she had chosen me to bring her the fire that would mark her daily ritual. Grandma's very particular version of story time. This evening, like most evenings at sunset, Grandma's ample figure rested on a boulder oddly placed in the middle of an open valley on the foothills of a mountain, or on the cantera platform on the entrance to her house. Children of all ages sat at her feet, anxiously awaiting the daily rite that began when I, the chosen one, brought her the magical fire that would light our way to the thrill of her stories. Now listen, all of you, she rumbled, and, pausing for effect, and don't even dare to blink. At this, she snapped the fingers on her empty hand, causing all of us, of course, to blink. It was then that she began her story. And she would say, see the mountain over there? That mountain. Okay, that's Chilicotes. See the mountain over there? That's part of the mountain. It's a close-up, but, Yes, that one, the mountain of Chilicotes, she'd say and point to the west with her cigarette. We follow the light with our eyes and with our minds, already engrossed in the intensity of her words. Well, that mountain is enchanted. In it lies an entire town full of people. Our gaping mouths follow her, looking for the mountain, as if ready to swallow the words marked by the light of her slowly burning cigarette. Once upon a time, she would say, there was a town full of very happy people that lived there where the mountain now sits. They were happy. They were not good, God-fearing people. They did not follow the Lord's mandates. They drank and played and broke piñatas and cursed and danced and gossiped instead of going to church to visit God. Of course, she said nothing about smoking. God didn't care about that. Once on a Good Friday, they forgot about God completely and went about their sinful ways. God became very upset and decided to curse the town. His curse was so powerful, of course he was God, that it suspended all life in town. Everyone died. That they died in a painless death. They simply froze in place. They were petrified. The drunkards' men's faces were captured by God's eyes as if by the lens of a still camera. At the moment they placed beer cans on their lips, the liquid never reaching their thirsty mouths. The women, whose laughter was vulgar and loud, were forever caught on their gaping gesture, as if entranced in an infinite mock. And the children, those children who played instead of taking flowers to the Virgin, well, they were tired for eternity on a floorless jump. Even the cats were condemned to a perpetual silent. She formed the words on her lips, and our gaze hung on her soundless. She would then laugh a silent laugh that would make us shiver, fearing we would share the destiny of the people in the eerie tale at the hands of this goddess of storytelling. She would sense the fear in our eyes and break up the macabre tale with a command that imitated church talk. I order you, she'd say in a solemn voice, thou should go home and dine. We shall continue the story tomorrow. She laughed her grandmother laugh now, bringing us back to our own reality of orange sunsets, hopscotch, tag, and other children's games. We obeyed and dispersed, afraid we would indeed end up like the people on the enchanted mountain, frozen in time by the words of this old woman who had marked us with her lighted finger and her lightning words. The next day, she continued her scary word path. And I quote, the town, she would begin, comes alive once a year on Good Friday. On that day, the church bells ring once again, and the people laugh and play. But they fail to repent and pray to their Savior, and the town goes back to its mortal state once the clock strikes midnight. She cited at the thought, a little disheartened. We cited at the thought, a little disheartened. Grandma's story was not as scary as we had hoped it to be, but Grandma would not disappoint. Do not go to the mountain on Good Friday, she would say. Her words stressed once more with the light at the end of her finger. The mountain will swallow you, and you will never be able to return home. In fact, if you go to Los Chilicotes on Good Friday, you will find an enormous snake that will lead you to one of the sides of the mountain. You will forever join the enchanted people of Los Chilicotes. Years pass, and we have forgotten about Grandma's story. My cousins and I decided to visit the mountainside hot springs in a village called Hervideros. And the water that you see there is actually hot. That's part of the river, but it's actually from the boiling springs. Once a sprawling town, Hervideros was nothing more than a ghost town. Tourists visited to bathe in what were said to be miraculous or healing waters. Upon our arrival, we searched for the bathhouse keepers, but did not find them. Instead, we saw an old lady waiting out the fury of the late afternoon sun under a mesquite tree. She seemed odd there, alone, in what appeared to be a white party dress, with her hair braided in colorful silk ribbons. We did not think much of it, wanting to capture the beauty of the mountain, the river running to the north and south, and the valley with a video camera. We asked her what the best way to approach the mountain was, so that we could climb it. She pointed to a spot on the east end of the mountain, and we hurried to it, but not before asking her if she would allow us to film her. She nodded, and we filmed her, continuing promptly with our journey. We took pictures and captured the whole scene on video and then decided to leave. My cousin said that perhaps we should go back, say goodbye to the old lady, and thank her once again for showing us the way to the mountain. We searched, but were unable to find her. We ran into Zoraida, the bath housekeeper. Could you please tell us where to find the lady who showed us the way to the mountain? We asked her. Figuring in a town as empty as Hervideros, it would be easy for her to point us in the direction of such a peculiar character. We described the dress the woman was wearing and the ribbons on her hair. Zoraida stared at us with a question in her eyes. She allowed us to finish our tale and then said, "No one lives in this town but my husband and I, and our children," she added, looking at us as if we were crazy. We thanked her and went on our way, certain that the video would confirm the presence of the old woman in Hervideros. We rushed home and prepared to watch our videotape. As much as we searched, we never found the woman in the white dress. All we saw was a large serpent following us on our way to the mountaintop. It was then that I noticed the calendar right next to the TV set. "Good Friday," it screamed, its red letters almost escaping the page. To this day, I'm happy I left Chilicote's mountain before midnight. And my cousins and I still know it is important to obey Grandma, especially at dinner time. "Thou shalt go home and dine," we still hear her. Grandma's voice still seems to be lingering in my ears, and I'm still afraid of lighting a faro cigarette. I fear it will burn eternally. So that's one of the stories that I wanted to share with you. And of course, it's fictionalized. You know, I'm just picking up some of her stories and then doing my own thing with them, right? It's a whole different thing. So that's one grandma, and the boiling springs and the mountaintop there. Have one more story to share with you, and then we can do questions, or I can do other stories, whatever you want. But I'm happy to entertain questions. I can talk about, anything you want to talk about, having to do with Latinx studies, literature, poetry, anything you want. The stories, storytelling, and indigenous traditions, whatever you feel like talking about. So this here is my other grandmother, the one that's very indigenous. Her name is Isabel. And that's my mom's mom. Her family has lived in the area since before the Spaniards arrived. I used to go to the hot springs with her, and there was a cave. And sometimes we got caught in the rain, and rain there is kind of scary, lots of thunder, and really scary. So she would take me to this cave and said, we can wait here. We can wait out the rain. And I would ask her, how do you know this cave? She would always say, our people would hide here. And I never understood what she meant. Our people would hide here. And I was like, what? Our people? What do you mean? Eventually, I figured out that was a cave. There was a tunnel that went from one town to the next, and that's where the indigenous people would hide from the Spaniards as they fought each other during colonization. So I never knew that I had a piece of history right there, right? Eventually, some archaeologists came to my town and asked to borrow the keys to our house because our house was empty and it had a bathroom. And they took out a lot of stuff from that place. So it was an important archaeological site, right? And so this is my grandmother sitting there. She's the one who used to make the tortillas. See how in shape she was? All the tortillas she made. She was very tired, the poor thing. And this right here is her house many years after she died. She died in the 90s. I forget what year, but in the 90s. And this is her house maybe like 2 years ago. I went to visit. Nobody is in there. The children still cannot agree on what they're going to do with it. So now it's just a broken house, and sadly. But there's one thing that's still very much alive, and that's her garden, which is what you see in the middle. It's still alive in a place that is pretty dry. And there is the fig tree. I don't know if you can see, the leaves of the fig tree, but the fig tree is right there. And that's the portion of the story that I'm going to tell. And a little bit of background information, because my grandmother was of indigenous heritage. What they used to do with their things when the Spaniards would come into town, they would bury things that they did not want anybody to find. So, it's not unusual for somebody to dig and find indigenous artifacts, right, in anywhere. So when she was getting ready to move on, she felt death knocking on her door, and she told my cousin, tell Mija. Mija is, my daughter. That's what she called me. She said, tell Mija that I'm leaving her my metate. I'm leaving her my grinding stone because we had spent a whole year, remember, grinding masa for tortillas. She says, and I'm going to leave her two things. I'm leaving her my grinding stone and my sewing machine, a Singer from the 1800s that I still do have in Waukesha. I brought it all the way here. And she says, but the grinding stone, I'm going to bury it underneath the fig tree. Tell her that's where she needs to look for the grinding stone. So when I went back after she passed, I went to look for the grinding stone underneath the fig tree. And that's what I'm doing there. We are digging to see if we can find, you can see my shadow, that's me. We're digging to see if we can find the grinding stone. Well, I never found it. It was gone. Probably somebody else got it, right? Which is fine because I found it in my story, where I wrote about this experience from a whole different perspective, right? So I'm going to, now that you have the backstory, I'm going to read you the fig tree. It's late afternoon. The 5 o'clock sun dances in the tiny yellow flowers carpeting the ground. Se llaman ojos de chanate. Tere smiles, guessing the question hanging from my eyes, not yet finding a home on my lips. It was then that I saw the water drops right there on the flowers on Grandma's abandoned garden. That's so strange, Tere said. The flowers are wet. Wet? What do you mean wet? I protested. It has not rained in months. We were in Grandma's garden, remembering how much she had loved her garden and how she had cared for it. The English is not as good as the Spanish because I'm still editing, okay? So you may hear some weird things. I'm hearing them as I speak. Even now, 20 years after her death, Grandma's garden with its fig and peach tree was still lush, as if Grandma herself were still there, whispering life to it every morning with her loving hands. La abuela, I cited. You know, Tere, I've still to find the metate that she buried in the garden before she died. She wanted me to have it. She left you her metate? Wow, that's one beautiful memory you have of hers. And you still haven't found it? No, Tio Lalo and I were here years ago digging by the fence where Cousin Lily said Abuela had buried it. Ay, amiga, Tere laughed. And you plan to take that to the U.S. with you? It was then we noticed that a small rainbow had formed on a drop of water, balancing exactly expertly in the dark eye of an ojo de chanate flower. The ojo de chanate flowers are the Daisy Susans. Is that the one with the, what is it? One-eyed Susans. Those are the ojos de chanate. So you can picture the flower, right? The one-eyed Susans. The rainbow gave the humble flower a magical feel as it sat there in the middle of the uneasy field. There, Ted and I squatted and examined the wet little flowers, trying to figure out why they were wet. The house had been abandoned since Abuela's death 20 years before. And it was September. And it had last rain in Las Tunas, that's what I call the fictional town, on July 8th. I remember the date of the rain, the last rain clearly because it had coincided with Abuela's birthday. And like her, it was a subtle but firm rain. Anxious to understand the miracle, we looked closely until we found the source of the water that had kept Abuela's garden green. It rains little in Las Tunas, but when it does, water washes away the soil all the way to the river. When the Tepehuanes and Santiago rivers rise, their waters sing their chocolate song all the way to the Rio Ramos, waiting for them a few kilometers north of Las Tunas. That is exactly what happened to Abuela's garden. The water had washed away the soil, exposing a hose buried below the surface. So you think it's magical, right? It's just a hose. But it can't be magical. Time had opened some small holes on the plastic surface of the hose, opened with it a way to maintain Abuela's garden water, alive even during this merciless drought that was slowly killing the cornfields in Las Tunas. Then I followed the hose until we lost sight of it, right underneath the fig tree. We sat on a rock. Our conversation focused on the year that I spent with Abuela making cheese. We would start our day at the metate, grinding the cornmeal to make tortillas. I was not very good with el metate, but I had a special talent for removing the tortillas from the comal without burning my fingers. I still do. I have always had long fingernails, and that's what I used to pick up the tortillas without burning. And that's why Abuela had willed me her metate, because I spent a whole year with her in the kitchen making tortillas and cheese. I was 11 then. Paperwork and other adult matters that I did not understand had kept me away from school for a year between elementary school and middle school. I spent that year in Abuela's kitchen or walking on the edge of the river, thinking time would be mine forever to do as I please. Sitting under the fig tree, I started digging with a rock on the ground around me. The afternoon and the rocks seemed to exist precisely for that purpose, for me to dig on the ground and on memory as I shared stories with my dear friend Tere. Sitting there, we looked like two women who had reached past their 50th birthday, but we were more than that. Tere and I had been lifelong friends. We had been friends since the day in first grade when we monitored who got to borrow her pencil sharpener and who did not. And there we were still, two friends digging to memory. The afternoon in the shade under the fig tree seemed made for that, for digging. It was then that I noticed the harsh, hard skin of the rock protruding through the small surface of exposed ground I had been digging. Tere, I told my friends, look, I think that's... Tere knew what I was about to say. El metate, she said, it's el metate. Really? You really found it? I've been looking for years. We headed over to the shed where Abuelo kept his tools, and we found a pick and a shovel. We took them and went back to digging, careful not to harm the metate, whose shape we could fully see protruding from the ground. I also saw a small wooden box, and I picked it up carefully, for the wood was beginning to decompose. It contained the only picture that ever existed of Abuela as a teenager, a picture I had never seen. She was wearing a long skirt and a long sleeve shirt, her arms longer than the sleeves, hanging on the sides of her also long legs. Her small torso led to a long neck, on top of which rested a small head, and her face, framed by the high cheekbones of her ancestors. Abuela's eyes were big and expressive. It was a picture of Abuela wrapped in the innocent awkwardness of her teenage years. It was a picture of me wrapped in the awkward innocence of my teenage years. It was a picture of the two of us. It is the two of us, Abuela and I, and the fig tree, and the metate. And this afternoon, in which we found each other again in her garden, taken there by the magic of some with florecillas, and yielding in the firm amidst the drought. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Pilar Melero. Thank you.